They called her a translator. Part 1. The daughter he never mentioned. The medical technician's name was Specialist Dobbins, and he had worked the Fort Bragg clinic long enough to read damage the way a mechanic reads an engine. Not just what broke, but how and from what direction and how much force stood behind it. He had never seen anyone fill out paperwork the way the woman in exam room 3 was filling out paperwork. She sat on the edge of the examination table, back straight, feet flat on the floor. Her left eye was swelling shut. A cut on her lower lip had stopped bleeding, but would open again if she moved her mouth too much. The bruising along her cheekbone was the dark, immediate kind that follows bone-on-bone impact at real velocity. Her face looked like it had been introduced to something large and fast, and she had simply decided not to discuss it. Her right hand moved across the medical form with complete steadiness, each letter precise, each box filled correctly. The handwriting of someone trained to write legibly in darkness on uneven surfaces under conditions where a misread word ends a mission. Dobbins set a fresh ice pack on the counter beside her. She picked it up without looking, placed it against her cheekbone, and kept writing. He asked if she wanted to file a formal incident report. She said it was a training accident. She did not look up. Dobbins nodded and left the room. Sometimes the most professional thing a medic can do is recognize when a patient has made a decision and nothing in his toolkit will change it. Outside exam room 3, the October light was doing what North Carolina light does in that season, turning everything amber and long-shadowed, making the scrub pine and red clay look like a painting rendered from memory. The Fort Bragg perimeter road ran past the clinic. Personnel moved along it with the purposeful stride of people for whom the ground itself is part of the mission. Master Sergeant Owendale stood 30 feet from the clinic window with a coffee he had not touched. He had been watching the window for 4 minutes. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was his unit, his assignment, or his official concern in any capacity. Owendale was a ranger attached to the Joint Advanced Combat Assessment Program as an observer and evaluation consultant, and the woman in exam room 3 was not his problem. But he had been in enough places where things went sideways to know the difference between someone who was hurt and someone who was performing being hurt worse than they were. The woman in exam room 3 was doing neither. She was performing being hurt less than she was. He had been in the JACA training room 3 hours earlier when Major Brett Caulfield drove his elbow into her face. He had watched the impact register. He had heard the crack, that specific flat sound that experienced people identify immediately as bone-on-bone at genuine velocity. He had watched her go down. And then he had watched her put her left hand on the edge of the training mat, palm flat, thumb aligned with the first knuckle, weight distributed through the heel of the hand. 18 years in the United States Army. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq. Enough joint exercises with SEAL teams and special forces to understand what that stabilization grip meant. It was not something acquired in a language school. It did not come from a translation certification program or 4 years of college followed by a NATO liaison posting. That grip came from somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 hours of close quarters training in environments where getting it wrong had permanent consequences. He drank his cold coffee and kept watching. He did not know her name yet. That was going to change. Her name was Riley Carr, and she had grown up 8 miles from where she was standing. Not from Fort Bragg proper, but from Fayetteville, the town that shapes itself around a military installation the way water shapes itself around stone, absorbing its rhythms, its vocabulary, its particular relationship with departure and return. Population 90,000. Home to the 82nd Airborne and the United States Army Special Operations Command, and one specific house on Caldwell Street where a girl with her father's eyes learned to shoot a rifle before she could drive a car. Her father was Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Carr. Official documents described him with words like distinguished and exceptional and consistently demonstrated superior performance, which is the military's way of saying that a man could do things others couldn't and did them without needing anyone to witness it. He stood 5 feet 11 inches and had his daughter's quality of stillness, not blankness, but a complete and deliberate management of expression, taking in everything, showing nothing. Thomas Carr served 22 years in the United States Army before his assignment to Dragon SEAL, a designation that remained classified above top secret for reasons that had at the time a rational basis. Every Saturday morning from the time Riley was 14 until she was 18, Thomas Carr took her to the range behind the house, 25 by 40 feet of cleared red clay, a packed earth berm at the far end, targets from 50 meters out to 400. He started her on iron sights. Not because optics were inferior, they were better, but Thomas Carr believed you learned to trust a tool only after you understood what the tool was doing for you, and you understood that only by first doing it without the tool. Iron sights, proper cheek weld, breath control, 4 counts in hold, 4 counts out hold. The natural respiratory pause at the bottom of the exhale, that half-second window when the body is entirely still. The front post is aligned and the trigger breaks between heartbeats. Riley had her father's hands. Long fingers, narrow palms, the kind of hands that looked too fine for what they could do. By 16, she was shooting consistent 4-inch groups at 300 meters with an M24 her father had acquired through proper channels. By 18, the groups were tight enough that Thomas Carr stopped writing down the numbers. He never told her she was good. He told her she was getting there every session. You're getting there. She understood later that this was the highest compliment he knew how to give. It meant he still saw distance between where she stood and the standard he was measuring her against. The day he stopped saying it would be the day he decided she had arrived. He never got to stop saying it. September 14th, 2019 does not appear in any official record, accessible without a security clearance that begins with top secret and ends with a compartment designation most people in the United States government have never heard of. What occurred that night in a dry riverbed in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, surrounded by limestone ridgelines that satellite imagery renders as abstract, gray geometries, has never been briefed to any congressional committee, mentioned in any press release, or acknowledged by any branch of the United States military. 11 people went in, 1 came out. Riley was 21 years old and was not in that valley. She was in a communications room at a forward operating base 90 kilometers west, monitoring Dragonseal's operational frequency as part of her first-year DEIA training. Observe only, no comms, no intervention, educational exposure to real operational traffic. She had the headset on at 22:17 when her father's voice came through. Grid confirmed, moving to extraction. The voice she had known her entire life, the voice that said, pass the salt at dinner, and called wind corrections on the range and told her you're getting there after she put 10 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 meters. That voice on a military frequency in a valley in Afghanistan, speaking the words that should have ended a mission and brought 11 people home. She counted 14 minutes. Then Sergeant First Class Danny Webb's voice came through and it sounded nothing like itself. Car grid is wrong. We are taking fire. Grid is wrong. We need sound she has never described to anyone because accurate description would require a kind of precision she will not apply to it. Then static. Then nothing. She sat in the communications room for 6 hours with the headset still around her neck. Nobody came to tell her anything. Nobody came to find her. She sat with the dead frequency and said nothing. This is what grief looks like at 21 when you have been trained to manage your external state. Very quiet, takes up very little space, looks from the outside like composure. It is not composure. Patricia Carr, Riley's mother, was diagnosed with cardiac failure 11 weeks after the funeral. The doctors called it unrelated to stress. Riley sat in the hospital room in Fayetteville and held her mother's hand and made 2 promises. To her father, who was gone and could not hear, I won't use what you taught me to fight anymore. I've seen what it costs. I'm done. To her mother, who was right there, I'm coming home. Whatever I do, I'm coming home. You have my word. She became a translator. She had the languages for it. Dari Pashto Arabic, she had been learning them since she was 12 because Thomas Carr believed that understanding the language of the people you worked with was the only honest form of intelligence gathering. She was genuinely excellent at it. The DIA did not waste the talent. 2 years of translation work reports with an unusual quality of insight for someone whose official role was purely linguistic. In the spring of 2024, they gave her a different assignment. Fort Bragg, Joint Advanced Combat Assessment Program. Interpreter Attachment NATO Liaison. 90 days later extended to 120. The folder on her desk had one name written on the tab in black marker. Brett Caulfield. Fort Bragg in October carries a particular atmosphere that people stationed there develop a complicated relationship with over time. Gun oil and pine resin in the metallic undertone of equipment used and cleaned and used again past counting. Aircraft running at hours that ignore the concept of morning. The whole installation humming with the energy of a machine designed never to stop. Riley had arrived 108 days before the morning she ended up in the medical clinic. She spent those 108 days being a translator. A good one. Her Pashto work was detailed enough that 2 separate intelligence officers had requested her specifically for document review. Her diary was clean enough that she caught contextual errors in 3 intercept analyses that would have produced incorrect tactical assessments. She filed every report on time, attended every assigned briefing, maintained professional relationships with everyone in her contact list, and gave no outward indication that she was anything other than what her orders said she was. The folder on her encrypted personal device, the one with hardware encryption and a physical key that stayed on her body, was labeled Caulfield. Inside it were 108 days of behavioral observation. Network maps, which officers owed him favors, which ones he had pressured, and how. The precise way he moved through institutional spaces, identifying and isolating people who knew too much, asked too many questions, or simply made him uncertain about his position. She had documented him running this pattern 5 times in 4 months. 3 had resulted in reassignments. 1 had produced a medical separation. None had produced accountability. Brett Caulfield was 42 years old and had spent 2 decades building something that was more architecture than career. The foundation was genuine. He had deployed. He had been in real places where real things happen, and he had survived them with legitimate credit. The structure above the foundation was different, built from borrowed stories and cultivated alliances, and the kind of reputation that substitutes for a record if you build it thick enough. He ran the JACA Combatives program with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged in that space, and he used physical presence the way some men use argument, as a form of assertion that requires no logic to land. Riley had been watching him for 108 days. She had documented everything. On day 108, she decided she had enough to begin the final phase. She walked into the JACA Advanced Training Room at 0900, carrying a notepad, and her interpreter credentials and the professional neutrality she had worn every day for 4 months, like a second uniform. 14 multinational observers were assembled around the perimeter of the tactical mat. British SAS sergeants, German Bundeswehr liaisons, Norwegian army officers, a Canadian ranger captain with the patience of someone accustomed to cold. Owen Dale was there too, attached as an observer consultant 2 weeks earlier, standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes moving around the room in the careful way of someone who had learned that the most important things in a space are often not what the space was designed to show. Caulfield entered at 0903. He moved through the room the way he always moved, like the geometry had been arranged for his benefit. His seal trident caught the overhead fluorescence. His instructor patch was precisely positioned. He was by objective measure physically imposing and credentialed, and he understood how much work those facts did for him before he said a word. He saw Riley immediately. She had positioned herself exactly far enough from the wall to register as an anomaly in his sightlines. Woman, small, notepad, translation services. Wrong room. His eyebrows did the thing they always did when he identified someone he had already categorized. A fraction of a second of satisfaction quickly smoothed back. He crossed the room. The exchange lasted 90 seconds. He told her the room was for operators. She requested participation in the day's drill sequence. She watched his face process this as an opportunity rather than a threat, watched him arrive at the conclusion that her presence here was useful rather than inconvenient. He smiled. He told her he would demonstrate a basic disarm technique. She could observe, learn what real operators did when things got messy. He turned back to the center of the mat without waiting for her response. She moved to the position he indicated, breathing on its 4-count pattern. She cataloged the room automatically: sight lines, exit distances, camera positions, the wall-mounted, biometric sensor array installed as part of the NATO precision monitoring upgrade 18 months earlier. She had read the Fort Bragg facility modification reports before arriving. The sensors logged every impact above 20 pounds of force, tagged to personnel IDs, timestamped and archived automatically. Caulfield was not looking at her. He was watching his audience, ensuring witnesses building the moment. He moved without the signals that precede legitimate training: contact, no verbal warning, no speed reduction, no positioning for a controlled demonstration. His elbow drove at her face with the full weight of 220 pounds behind it. She did not attempt to block it. This decision had been made in the 10 seconds between his first word and his first movement, the way her father had taught her to make decisions under time pressure. Not just what you gain, but what it costs, and whether the cost is affordable, and whether the alternative is more expensive. The sensors needed a genuine impact. 14 international witnesses needed to observe genuine violence, not a training accident. The documentation needed to be real because everything built on this moment would be challenged by a man practiced at making evidence disappear. The impact was absolute. Her head snapped back. Blood filled her mouth. Her knees found the mat and she stayed there, one knee down, not because she couldn't rise, but because the position served the record, and her left hand found the mat edge without instruction from her conscious mind. Palm flat, thumb aligned, weight through the heel of the hand. Thousands of repetitions expressing themselves in the most honest possible way before thought, before decision, before any gap between intention and result. 3 feet to her left, Owen Dale stopped breathing. Not the impact. He had witnessed impacts. What stopped him was the hand. He had seen that exact stabilization grip demonstrated once before at a SEAL close quarters refresher at Dam Neck in 2019. The instructor had used it as an example of unconscious operator foundation work. He had said it required a minimum of 3,000 training hours before it became automatic. He had said that until it was automatic, it was useless. The entire point was that it happened before you decided to do it. It had happened before she decided to do it. Owen Dale filed this under things that did not make sense, but felt like they would eventually. Caulfield addressed the room. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone confirming a belief rather than discovering a truth. He told them what they had just witnessed. He talked about commitment and conditioning and the difference between people who understood combat and people who thought they did. Colonel Greer Whitaker's voice came from the control booth doorway. He was 54 years old with 26 years in the Army, and he had reached full colonel by paying attention to things others in rooms decided weren't worth their time. He had a coffee cup in his left hand and a tablet in his right, and an expression his staff had learned to read with precision because a specific configuration of his face preceded consequences, and that configuration was present now. He asked in a level voice what had just occurred. Caulfield answered with the fluency of a man who had answered this category of question before. Training demonstration. Captain Carr had requested participation. He was illustrating the realities of close quarters engagement. Whitaker descended from the booth. His eyes went to Riley, who was rising controlled, no hand to the wall vertical, as if the ascent required no more effort than standing in a corridor. He told her she was bleeding. She told him she had observed this. He cleared the room. All personnel 15-minute break. The door closed with the precision of people who understood the need for it. Before it did, Owen Dale paused at the threshold. He found Riley's eye, held it for 1 second, nodded once fractional containing more than most paragraphs, and walked into the corridor. Riley stood with blood drying on her chin, while Whitaker asked Caulfield to explain why he had struck a superior officer in front of international witnesses. She listened with part of her attention, while another part did what her father had built into her over 4 years of Saturday mornings: assess, inventory, adjust. Impact on record. 14 witnesses, 3 camera angles, biometric sensors with precise force measurement, medical documentation beginning shortly. 108 days of patience had purchased exactly this. That night, Whitaker stood alone in his office and opened the biometric anomaly alert the sensor system had generated. Partial match, insufficient data to resolve, classification lock on deeper access. He ran a search on the unit designation in the partial match header. Dragon seal, authorization level insufficient, record sealed. He sat with that for a moment. Then he typed another search, a name he had not entered into any system in 4 years. Not because he had forgotten it, but because some things should be left to rest until they were ready to be disturbed. Thomas Carr. The system processed for 4 seconds. Record sealed. Classification TS/SCI. Whitaker set his tablet on the desk and looked out at the Fort Bragg flight line, where aircraft lights moved in patterns that never changed, regardless of what year it was or what was happening on the ground. He had served with Thomas Carr for 7 years. He had known his quality not from a file, but from standing beside the man when everything broke down and watching what he did. He had stood in the rain at the funeral and said nothing because Thomas Carr had been the kind of man who would have found excessive words embarrassing. He had not known Thomas Carr had a daughter assigned to his installation. 8 miles away, Riley Carr sat on her quarters bunk and opened the Caulfield folder on her encrypted device. She scrolled past 108 days of documentation, opened a new entry, typed 3 words at the top. Phase 2 begins. She closed the device and lay back and breathed 4 counts in hold, 4 out, hold. And somewhere in the measured center of her chest, something that had been waiting for 4 years and 4 months settled slightly like a weight, finding its proper position. Not relief, readiness. The kind that comes when the waiting is finally finished and what remains is simply the work. Part 2, the trap inside the trap. The first move came before breakfast. Riley found out at 0617, standing at the advanced training roster outside the ACA operations building, reading through 12 names twice before accepting that hers was absent. Advanced close quarters battle qualification track for the week. Every slot filled, not with her name. Captain Warren Hester arrived at 0620 with coffee that smelled considerably better than anything the dining facility produced. He was compact, early 40s, with the manner of a man who had spent his career navigating between decision makers and the people who lived with those decisions. He saw her at the roster board. His expression did the thing expressions do when a person has been anticipating an uncomfortable conversation and it has now arrived. She told him there was an error. He said there was no error. Major Caulfield had submitted a revised list the previous evening. She had been removed for medical evaluation reasons. She told him her medical clearance was filed at 1700 hours the day before. Full duty status. He said she would need to take that up with Major Caulfield. She told him that Caulfield did not have unilateral authority to modify NATO training schedules, that such modifications required duty officer coordination and program director approval, and she asked which authorization code he had used. Hester's coffee cup stayed at his mouth longer than the temperature warranted. He said he just posted the names he was given. She held his gaze for a moment, not aggressively, with the kind of complete attention that some people find more unsettling than confrontation, because it suggests what you are saying is being filed in ways you cannot anticipate. She thanked him and left. She did not look back through the glass panel beside the office door. She knew he was already reaching for the desk phone, dialing the 3-digit extension she had mapped 2 weeks earlier. When Hester felt uncertain about something he had done, his first response was to report upward and wait for the reassurance of the person who had asked him to do it. She logged the exchange on her encrypted device in SX28. Phase 2. Move 1. The second move came before lunch. Her security card was declined at the intelligence briefing room at 1,000 hours. Not expired. Declined. The red light had the quality of a recent decision made at the administrative level by someone with access to the clearance management system. The walk to Building 7 took 12 minutes. The security administration office on the second floor smelled like printer toner and the staleness of a room where the same conversations had been cycling for years with different names attached. The specialist behind the desk, a young man named Albright, had been briefed peripherally that she might appear. His expression when she placed her ID card on the counter confirmed this. He told her the system showed a security flag on her clearance. Pending investigation. She asked what investigation. He said the system didn't specify. Just pending review. Access limited to essential areas only. She asked who had initiated the flag. He typed. His eyebrows rose slightly. Security Compliance Office, a channel that placed an institutional category between the flag and the person who entered it. She asked who the investigating officer was for clearance flags at her level. He checked his screen. Colonel Whitaker, he said. He handles all flags above basic threshold. She picked up her card and left. In the stairwell between floors, she stopped on the landing and stood still for 30 seconds. Not from distress, from the discipline of a person who has learned that the 30 seconds following significant information are the most important 30 seconds, and what you do with them determines the quality of everything after. Caulfield had moved on 2 fronts, simultaneously training access and security access. She had documented him use this exact pattern twice before against other personnel. Both times the targets had filed complaints. Both times a counter-narrative formed around their instability and poor professional judgment. She was not going to file a complaint. She was going to let him keep building. At 1847, her tablet showed an incoming message from an unrecognized address. No subject line, 1 attachment, 4 megabytes. She carried it to an empty briefing room, locked the door, positioned herself with her back to the wall, and full sight lines to both the door and the window, and opened the file. Footage from the JAK training room. She watched it once without expression, then 3 more times, pausing at specific frame transitions, mapping the places where someone had reordered footage to transform a clean disarm demonstration she had performed with Owen Dale 2 weeks earlier, controlled textbook technique, into something that looked like fumbling and incompetence, requiring correction from a more experienced operator. The NATO watermark was authentic. The timestamp was authentic. The manipulation was professional, not rushed work. Someone with system access, archival permissions, and enough technical skill to execute edits that wouldn't survive forensic analysis but wouldn't flag casual review. She forwarded the original to her secure personal server, filed it under fabricated evidence, and opened the transmission metadata. Primary IP anonymized, secondary routing node not. It traced to a workstation on the Fort Bragg internal network. Registered to the JACA Range Operations Office. To Captain Warren Hester. She sat with this. Caulfield had not sent the video himself. He had used Hester as a layer, either direct access to the workstation or Hester executing the transmission without full understanding of what he was carrying. Either way, Hester was now a documented link in a documented chain. And chains had a property that people who built them sometimes forgot every link was also a point of failure. The following morning, Owen Dale found her in the dining facility at 0545. He did not announce himself. He carried his tray over 30 seconds after she sat down in the way of a man making himself available without creating an obligation for either party. He told her he had heard about the clearance flag and the roster removal. She acknowledged this. He set a folded piece of paper beside her tray without ceremony. She unfolded it. 3 lines, printed from a partially declassified after-action document, the kind released without anyone noticing what remained visible in the portions they had cleared. Tactical liaison confirmed coordinates at 2217. Ground team entered at 2231. Contact at 2247. She read it twice. She folded it along its original creases and placed it in her pocket. Owen Dale ate his eggs. He said without emphasis that he did not know who she was or what she was doing at Fort Bragg, and that he was not asking. He said he had spent 19 years in the Army learning to read situations, and this one did not feel like something he wanted to look away from. He said, "I know who Thomas Carr was." The dining facility was quiet at that hour, the handful of other personnel far enough away that normal conversation was private. Riley looked at the window. Gray October light coming in over the pine line at the installation's eastern edge. She thanked him. He nodded once, and they finished their food and went separate directions. In the women's latrine on the second floor of the operations building, Riley stood at the sink and ran cold water and looked at her face in the mirror for a count of 20. The bruising had moved from purple into yellow-green. Surface damage healing on schedule. She dried her hands with deliberate, complete movements, taking 30 seconds to be fully present in exactly where she was and what she was doing. Then she went back to work. That night, she did not sleep at her standard time. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and her breathing on its 4-count cycle, and she went back to September 14th, 2019, not by choice, but because some nights the choice is not available. She was 21 in a forward operating base comms room in eastern Afghanistan. Solder and recycled air, and the plastic and metal smell of equipment that ran without interruption. Single overhead light, metal desk, frequency binder she had memorized the first day. There to learn. Her father's voice at 2217 completely calm grid confirmed. Moving to extraction, the same voice that said, "Pass the salt at dinner," and called corrections on the range, and said, "You're getting there," after she shot 10 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 meters. That voice on a military frequency saying the words that should have ended a mission and brought 11 people home. 14 minutes. Then Danny Webb's voice, a voice she had learned from 6 weeks of monitoring familiarization, a voice that sounded nothing like itself. "Car grid is wrong. Taking fire. Grid is wrong. We need..." Then sounds she has never described to anyone. Then static. She spent 6 years learning not to return to that room. She had built systems and disciplines and the architecture of a life oriented forward toward the mission, toward the folder, with its 108 days of patience. But on the night after Owen Dale placed 3 lines of after-action text beside her breakfast tray, the room returned in full dimensionality, and she sat in it for however long it required. In the morning, she rose at 4:30, ran her perimeter circuit, showered, ate, and checked her encrypted device. Mandatory range qualification. All personnel rostered for advanced tactical certification. 0600 Friday, leave ammunition, full combat simulation protocol. Routing metadata originated from Hester's office. Workstation ID call fields. She read it twice, set down the tablet, and walked to the armory. The armory smelled the way armories smell: oil and metal, and the orderliness of a space where every item has a place and specific accountability and specific consequences for the absence of either. The duty sergeant signed her in at 0900. She had submitted the inventory request the previous day through standard channels approved without comment, because weapons inventory requests from properly cleared personnel generate no interest. She worked methodically through the rack. Standard pace for a 30-weapon inventory, approximately 40 minutes. Riley was on her 22nd weapon when her thumb found something wrong. The optic mounting rail had a fresh scratch in it, new metal exposed, recent abrasion. She held the rifle under the work light and examined the rail with the attention of someone who has learned that small things are frequently load-bearing. The locking mechanism had been filed, not catastrophically, not in a way that would be visible in casual handling or fail immediately, in a way that would produce progressive loosening under recoil stress. Under a sustained qualification string, the optic would drift consistently off zero. Not enough to cause a mechanical malfunction. Enough to make every shot land wrong. She photographed the damage with her personal device weapon, serial number, modification position, tool marks indicating instrument type and approach angle, and continued the inventory. Second weapon at position 27. Same modification, slightly different tool geometry. 2 hands had worked on this, or one at different times under different conditions. Third weapon at position 31, rifle number 23. This one was the most careful. More time had been taken. The filing was deeper, the structural compromise more complete. Under significant recoil, a 10-round qualification string. At standard pressure, the optic would not merely drift. After the 3rd or 4th round, it would shift unpredictably. Precision shooting at 200 meters would become effectively impossible for anyone trusting the scope. She photographed it as she had photographed the others, logged the serial number, recorded every detail. She looked at the equipment assignment sheet clipped to the inventory board. Rifle 23 was assigned to her for Friday. She stood in the armory and held the weapon and ran the calculation her father had taught her, Not just what you gain, but what it costs and whether what you are buying justifies the price. She knew what Caulfield expected. Standard response report, the deficiency request, a replacement weapon document, everything. Or the alternative, she doesn't notice the modification and shoots badly in front of 15 witnesses and produces the public failure he needs. He was not expecting the third option. She signed the inventory report, logged all 3 deficient weapons with photographs in the permanent record, properly timestamped and uploaded to the secure inventory system. Then she signed out Rifle 23 as her qualification weapon. She returned it to the rack, initialed the form, and walked out of the armory into the October light. Friday arrived cold. The range at 0530 had the quality of all ranges before noise begins. Frost on the grass at the lane edges. The silence of a space built for loud things before the loud things start the sky, that specific pre-dawn gray that precedes light rather than follows it. Riley reported to the equipment window at 0545, received Rifle 23, ran her thumb across the mounting rail. The modification was unchanged. She signed the log and walked to the staging area. 15 personnel. The mix of NATO nationalities she had been working alongside for 4 months. Norwegian officers stamping against the cold, the Canadian Ranger captain drinking from a thermos, with the patience of someone for whom cold was a permanent professional condition. Owen Dale was positioned at the observation tower, binoculars around his neck, tablet in hand. He had arrived before anyone else. Riley noted this without expression. Colonel Greer Whitaker stood near the control booth with his coffee, not on the qualification roster. Present anyway. She had noted his vehicle in the parking area when she walked over from the equipment window. She filed this without reaction. Caulfield arrived at 5:58, 2 minutes before start, his standard choreography for situations he intended to control. Clipboard stopwatch, the instructor face she had studied for 4 months, the configuration of authority and readiness that functioned as both armor and weapon. He looked at her once. The look lasted 1 second and contained a complete read. She saw him register the rifle number, saw him understand she had received the weapon he arranged for her, saw the small postural adjustment that meant the first piece of his plan was positioned. He addressed the group. 10 rounds, 200 meters, 10 targets, 60 seconds, minimum 7 hits for qualification. He called her name first. Of course he did. She stepped to the firing line. Chamber check safety sight picture. The optic already showing the looseness that would develop under recoil. She could feel it in the mount's fractional give against her hand. She told Caulfield the optic mount appeared damaged. The mounting rail had been compromised and the optic would not hold zero under recoil. He walked over with the performance of a man conducting a thorough inspection. He rotated the rifle, examined the mount, handed it back. He said it looked fine to him. He said if she was uncomfortable with standard NATO equipment, perhaps that was worth noting in her qualification record. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she settled into firing position. The decision had been made in the armory. There was nothing to decide now. Cheek weld, natural point of aim, the 4-count breathing cycle her father had built into her over 4 years of Saturday mornings, until it was no longer technique but physiology. The optic was useless. She disregarded it entirely. Iron sights, the backup aiming system that was always present, always functional, always independent of components that could be compromised. Front post, rear aperture. The alignment between the two, the target and the point of aim that existed in the space between controlled breath and perfect stillness. Caulfield called the start. She fired. The rifle cracked flat into the cold morning air. She worked the trigger with the cadence her father had established on a range in Fayetteville when she was 14, and he was standing behind her saying nothing, because saying things was preparation, and preparation was finished, and what remained was only the work. 10 rounds, 47 seconds. The final 3 faster than the first 7 because she had confirmed 0 in the first 2 shots, and the remaining 8 were application of confirmed information. Cease fire. The electronic target carrier moved downrange and returned. Caulfield walked to the scoring station. She watched him look at the target. Watched the moment his processing produced a result that did not match his expectation. A small moment visible only to someone watching closely, which Owen Dale was, and which Whitaker was, from 40 feet away at the control booth railing. 10 hits, 9 in the center ring, 1 clipping the 9 ring. 98 out of 100. He turned around. His face had rearranged itself toward neutrality and had not quite arrived. He asked her how. She ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, engaged the safety, and held the rifle toward him. She said the optic was malfunctioning, so she had used iron sights. She said any operator familiar with their platform should be able to transition from optic to irons without significant accuracy loss. She said the backup aiming system existed precisely for situations where the primary system was compromised. She offered to let him inspect the rifle to verify the optic damage. He took it. He looked at the mounting rail. He looked at the filing marks on the locking mechanism. He looked at them for 4 seconds with the expression of a man who has just understood something and wishes he hadn't. Around them, the 15 observers processed in their various ways. Some looked at the target still in the scoring station. Some looked at Riley. The Norwegian officers exchanged a glance that communicated something compact. The Canadian Ranger captain put down his thermos with the deliberate movement of someone who no longer needed it. Owen Dale's binoculars were down. He was looking directly at Riley with an expression that contained, if you knew how to read small facial indicators, something close to what a man's face does when something he suspected is confirmed at a larger scale than the suspicion. Caulfield asked slowly where she had learned to shoot like that. She told him various assignments. He said to be specific. She told him some aspects of her service record were classified above his access level, and she was not authorized to discuss them in an open setting. Whitaker from the control booth railing set his coffee down. The range was quiet in the way spaces become quiet when something important has happened, and the people in it are deciding whether they understand what it was. Caulfield looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without adjustment. No challenge in it, no satisfaction, the same professional neutrality she had worn for 111 days. He had used the rifle modification to demonstrate her incompetence. She had used it to demonstrate his, in front of 15 international observers. 2 cameras. A colonel who had driven to a range before dawn because something had told him to be present when important things happened. There was nothing Caulfield could do in the next 4 minutes that would not make this worse. He knew this. She could see him arriving at the knowledge in real time. He addressed the remaining personnel with the composure of a man who had been publicly outflanked and was choosing not to acknowledge it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The qualification exercise continued. Riley returned the rifle to the equipment window, signed the return log, and walked to the observation area. She checked her encrypted device, logged time result witnesses, and filed it under Caulfield's subfolder, Day 111 section titled Phase 2 Complete. She put the device away and watched the remaining exercise. She did not have to wait long. By 1400 hours, Caulfield had filed a formal complaint, submitted through official channels to Joint Command, copied to NATO Command, distributed to 6 senior officers whose names he had calculated would carry maximum institutional weight. The complaint alleged that Captain Riley Carr had falsified her service credentials, misrepresented her qualifications, and was operating under fraudulent orders. He demanded immediate investigation, suspension of clearances, and confinement to quarters. He had filed it loudly, officially, and irreversibly. He had done exactly what she had spent 4 months and 112 days waiting for him to do, because now the investigation he was demanding would have to examine everything. Every allegation he had made, every piece of evidence he had submitted, every action he had taken over the previous 14 days, the rifle modifications documented in the Armory inventory system, the fabricated video archived on her secure server, with metadata trail the biometric force, data from the training room, the Somalia mission logs sitting in a DIY secure folder for 5 years, waiting for exactly this kind of formal proceeding to justify their release. Caulfield had just opened every door. He had signed the document that required them all to be walked through. Riley read the complaint notification in the empty briefing room, and she sat for 2 minutes in the quiet of it. Not satisfaction, not relief. The particular steadiness of a person who has done their work correctly and is now standing in the moment the work was for. She opened a new entry on her encrypted device. Phase 3. He's ready. Part 3. Thomas Carr's daughter. The notification that Agent Diane Merritt had arrived on post came through Whitaker's office at 0743 on Saturday morning, less than 18 hours after Caulfield filed his formal complaint. Riley was in the dining facility when her tablet showed the visitor log update. She read the entry, once finished her coffee, carried her tray to the collection point, and walked back to her quarters at the same measured pace. She had submitted the request for Merritt's deployment 11 weeks earlier through a DIA channel that existed 3 organizational levels below anything in the standard chart. The request included a projected timeline and 1 trigger condition, Caulfield filing a formal complaint through official military channels. Not because the evidence was incomplete. Before that moment, it had been complete at day 94. The trigger was a formal complaint because a formal complaint created a formal proceeding, and a formal proceeding created the only legal structure that transformed documentation into testimony, testimony into record, and record into something that could not be suppressed by a classification order initiated through channels that would now themselves be subject to scrutiny. Merritt had been at Fort Bragg since Friday afternoon in a room at the base guest quarters reading Riley's complete file, all 247 pages, for 14 hours, before Caulfield signed the document that brought her into the open. Riley spent Saturday morning doing what she always did before something that mattered not reviewing because there was nothing left to review. The architecture of what she had built was complete. Every beam and joint and load-bearing point was solid. What she was doing was the stillness that arrives when preparation is finished, and what remains is simply the doing. At 1400 hours, Whitaker's office sent the summons. Conference room B, 1500 hours, mandatory. The room had been rearranged. Same table, same chairs, same institutional lighting. What was different was the woman sitting to Whitaker's left and the empty chair beside the door that had not been part of the previous hearings. Diane Merritt set her briefcase on the table without opening it. Her expression held the professional neutrality of someone who had sat at enough of these tables to have stopped registering the furniture. Caulfield was already seated. Dress uniform ribbons aligned with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He looked composed the way a man looks when he has spent 18 hours building a version of events with enough internal logic that he has started to believe it himself. Whitaker opened the proceeding. The formal complaint was under review. Agent Merritt of the Defense Intelligence Agency was present for preliminary assessment. All parties were to provide complete and accurate statements. He looked at Caulfield. Caulfield presented his case with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it carefully and trusted the rehearsal. Captain Carr had demonstrated capabilities inconsistent with her stated assignment. Her behavior during the training incident, her resistance to legitimate administrative decisions regarding her clearance and roster status, her performance at Friday's range qualification, and her apparent familiarity with classified systems all indicated she was operating under false credentials. He used the words fraudulent and misrepresentation with deliberate legal weight. He sounded certain. Merritt let him finish. Then she picked up her phone, dialed an internal extension, and said 2 words, "Send him." The door opened 90 seconds later. Captain Warren Hester entered the conference room. He looked like a man who had not slept and had spent the hours he should have been sleeping, understanding that the next few minutes would determine the shape of everything that followed. He was 40 years old and had spent 17 of those years making small accommodations to larger forces, each one seeming minor enough to survive the accumulation carrying him to this room. He stood at the foot of the table and did not sit. Merritt told him she had the complete transmission log from his workstation. She had the base internal network records showing every node-to-node transfer executed from that terminal over the past 4 months. She had the archive footage request submitted through his login credentials and the edited video file sent from his IP address. She placed 3 documents on the table in front of him face up and did not add anything further. Hester looked at the documents. Then he looked at Caulfield. Caulfield's jaw set. His hands were flat on the table. He said nothing. Hester said in 2021, there was a weapons accountability discrepancy in the JACA inventory, a shortfall papered over through a misclassification. Caulfield had the documentation, had kept it for 3 years. He brought it out last month, said he needed access to the security archive and the footage management system. Said if Hester helped him, the 2021 file stayed where it was. Said if Hester didn't cooperate, it went to the Inspector General. Hester said he hadn't known what Caulfield planned to do with the access. He had told himself it was probably nothing significant, had told himself this enough times that it had begun to feel true. He said he knew what it had actually been. He looked at the table and said he was sorry. Not to Riley specifically. To the table or to the space between things, the way a person says something when they are past the point where the apology changes anything, but cannot stop themselves from making it. Whitaker said, "Take a seat, Captain." Hester sat. The chain of evidence was closed. The link Caulfield had built through leverage and the specific human vulnerability of a man who had made one compromising decision and found himself owned by it had now shut against him. Riley opened her folder. She laid documents on the table in order one at a time and described each one with the efficiency of a person who had thought about this sequence for a long time and no longer needed to think while executing it. The original training room footage from the west wall camera side by side with the edited version transmitted from Hester's workstation. Frame-by-frame comparison showing the cut points. Audio waveform analysis showing the 2 places the sound had been adjusted to mass transitions. Professional work. Also completely documented with no room for an alternative explanation. The biometric sensor data from the training room. Impact force 87 pounds tagged to Caulfield's personnel ID timestamp to the second. The NATO safety threshold for training demonstrations was 30 pounds. The sensors had been logging at this precision level for 18 months. The data had been sitting in the system the whole time waiting for someone to ask for it. The Armory inventory report from 4 days earlier. 3 rifles with documented mounting rail modifications. Serial numbers, photographs, tool mark analysis consistent with a specific file type. Weapon 23 assigned to her for Friday's qualification. Report filed in the standard system, timestamped initialed. The Somalia mission brief. Confirmed coordinates. Coordinates actually transmitted to Dragon Seal's operational frequency at 22:17 hours on September 14th, 2019. The margin of difference 340 meters. In the terrain of that Kunar Valley, 340 meters separated an extraction point from a ridgeline held by opposing force since nightfall. She placed the last document on the table. The Equipment Accountability Form from the JSOC, Attachment Log, a Tactical Communications Device Serial Number Issue, Date Receiving Individual. The signature was Caulfield's. The date was September 11th, 2019, 3 days before the mission. The room was quiet in the way that spaces become quiet when the final piece of something is placed, and the shape of the whole becomes visible all at once. Caulfield looked at the documents. His composure did not collapse. It receded a slow withdrawal from the surface, leaving something harder and older underneath. He said the Somalia investigation had been closed. Merritt said it had been sealed. She said there was a significant difference between those two things, and she believed he understood that difference. He said he had served this country for 20 years. Nobody responded. He looked at Riley. His expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere she recognized, not rage yet, but the stage before it, when a person is still searching for a version of events that does not end the way this one is ending. He said, "You planned all of this. You let me target you so you could build a case." She said yes. She said accusations without proof were noise, and 4 months of documented pattern across multiple independent systems was a case, and that was a difference worth understanding. Merritt told Caulfield he was confined to quarters effective immediately. CID would take custody within the hour. The proceeding against him would address the Somalia operation, the equipment tampering, Hester's coercion, and the training room assault. She told him the proceeding would also be examining the classification order that sealed the Dragon Seal files in 2019, including the chain of authorization that initiated it. Caulfield's chair moved back from the table. Not with calculation, not with the tactical awareness of a man trained in the geometry of rooms. He moved the way people move when the structure, organizing their life for 2 decades, comes down simultaneously, and what remains underneath is not strategy, but something older and rawer that does not think, that simply refuses. He came across the table, hands open, reaching for her throat. In the half-second before she moved, Riley thought of her father, not deliberately. The way certain things surface in certain moments without being called, the smell of red clay and gun oil. A Saturday morning, her father standing behind her without speaking, because speaking was for before, and before was finished, and what remained was the work. She had made the promise to him in a hospital chapel in Fayetteville. She broke it in a conference room at Fort Bragg. She did not hesitate. Her left hand came up and intercepted his right wrist, redirecting his forward momentum laterally. Her right hand found his elbow and applied pressure from below, using his own weight and velocity, though, as the force that completed the technique. She stepped offline, and Caulfield's own motion put him face down on the conference table, with his arm locked at the angle where resistance produced injury and compliance produced only discomfort. Less than 2 seconds. The flat impact of a large man making involuntary contact with a table surface. She held the hold. Her right arm was functional, grip solid, minimum force, complete control, zero injury to the subject. Her left shoulder was not. The old injury lived in the anterior labrum, product of a difficult extraction in her second year of DIA training, and healed to approximately 90% and stable for 3 years, the kind of damage you learn to manage until you encounter the specific loading angle that the remaining 10% cannot accommodate. She felt it go, not loudly. Something quiet and complete the joint, moving past the place it could move, and stopping, and in the space between those 2 points, the specific declarative pain of a structure doing what it was not built to do. She maintained the hold. She thought, this is what it costs. She thought her father would have understood the calculation, if not approved of the need for it. She thought some promises were worth breaking, and the measure of that worth was the weight of what stood on the other side, and 11 names on a wall was the weight she had been measuring against for 6 years. Whitaker had his hand on the emergency alert panel. Caulfield's voice came into the table surface, something about being set up, about what he had given, about the unfairness of what was happening. Riley said, "Major Caulfield, stop resisting." Her voice was level. 4 MPS arrived in 40 seconds. They took Caulfield with professional efficiency cuffs, writes the standard language of a proceeding that had moved from administrative to criminal. He was still constructing a narrative when they moved him through the door. The door closed. Riley released the hold. Her left arm stayed at her side. She straightened her uniform jacket with her right hand one motion and stood straight, the way she always stood. Merritt was on her phone at the window, speaking quietly. Whitaker stood at the head of the table, looking at Riley with an expression that held several things simultaneously. He said, "Your shoulder." She said it was manageable. He said that was not what he asked. She said, "Yes, sir," and did not add anything. He told her she would see the post surgeon before anything else. Not a request. He looked at the documents spread across the table, at the door, at Riley for a long moment. He said 112 days, not 4 months, 112 days. He had done the arithmetic himself, which meant he had been counting from somewhere. She said, "Yes, sir." He said Thomas Carr's name quietly, the way someone says a name they have been keeping in a private place for a long time. He said Thomas Carr was the finest officer he had served alongside in 26 years. He said he knew this not from a record, but from standing next to the man in the circumstances that reveal what people are built from. He had attended the funeral and stood in the rain and said nothing because Thomas Carr would have found excessive words embarrassing. He said he had not known Thomas Carr had a daughter assigned to his installation. Riley said her father had told her that when the time came, the colonel would recognize her without needing to be told. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. He nodded once, small, precise, requiring nothing added to it. The post-surgeon, Major Elaine Grady, worked with focused directness, building an accurate picture rather than confirming a conclusion already reached. She told Riley the labrum had retorn, partial but significant. With proper treatment and rehabilitation, she could expect to recover 70 to 75% of full function. Riley asked what that meant practically. Grady said shooting at distance with the left arm in full extension would produce pain that affected accuracy. Certain grip configurations would require compensation. Some things Riley had done before this afternoon, she would need to find different approaches to, and some things she might not do the same way again. Riley asked for the rehabilitation timeline. Grady gave her 8 weeks for partial release, 16 for full-duty certification. Riley thanked her and lay back for the imaging. She did not revisit the calculations she had made in the conference room. The shoulder was the cost of maintaining the control hold until the MPs arrived. She had known the joint was compromised from the first second of the technique. She had maintained the hold for 38 seconds after that. In her father's ranged notebooks, kept in a cardboard box under the bed at her mother's house in Fayetteville, there was a line he had written in the careful handwriting he applied to everything worth writing down. She had found it at 22 and no longer needed to look at it. The work costs what it costs. The question is never whether you are willing to pay. The question is whether what you are buying is worth the price. She looked at the clinic ceiling and thought about 11 names, and the answer was yes, and she let that be enough. 3 weeks later, 11 bronze plaques were installed on a section of memorial wall in the courtyard adjacent to Fort Bragg's Special Operations Garden. No public announcement, no ceremony with speeches and folded flags. The plaques were mounted on a Tuesday afternoon while the base ran its standard operations, and by evening they were simply there as they should have been 5 years earlier. Freed from the classification order that no longer had a legal basis, now that the Caulfield proceeding had moved into formal discovery, and the chain of authorization for that original sealing was itself under examination. 11 names, 11 Dragon Seal insignia, 11 dates of service, all ending September 14th, 2019. Riley came to the wall at 06:30 the following morning. She wore her dress uniform because it was correct to do so. The October light came in low and amber over the pine line, making the installation look considered and permanent. Her father's plaque was in the second row, third from the left. CWO Thomas Carr. She put her right hand on it. Her left was in the partial sling Grady had ordered for the first 4 weeks of rehabilitation, and she was complying because compliance with medical instruction was part of the work, and she had not come this far to stop doing the work correctly. She stood there. She did not speak because Thomas Carr had not been a man who required words when presence was available instead. They had stood on the range behind the house many times without speaking for long stretches, the companionable silence of two people doing something that mattered to both of them, a silence that had never needed to be filled and did not need to be filled now. She thought about the communications room in eastern Afghanistan and the white noise that replaced 11 voices and the 6 years between that night and this morning. She thought about the 2 promises made at different bedsides in different rooms, one to a man already gone, one to a woman fighting to stay. She thought about the conference room and the 2 seconds it had taken to break the first promise, and she thought that her father would have understood the arithmetic of it without approving of the necessity, and that both of those things could be true at the same time, and that learning to hold 2 true things that didn't fully reconcile was the kind of work he had been preparing her for since she was 14 years old, standing on red clay with a rifle slightly too large for her hands. She thought about her mother in Fayetteville, who had said on the phone 3 nights ago, "Your father would be proud of you." Not the polite kind of proud, the real kind. She stayed 11 minutes, 1 minute for each name on the wall. Behind her at 20 feet, she heard footsteps approach and stop. She did not turn around. Owen Dale stood at 20 feet and did not come closer. He had come the same way she had not, because this was his unit, or his designation, or his official concern, but because some things require witness, and showing up for them is what you do when you are the kind of person who shows up. He stood for the same 11 minutes. When she finally lowered her hand and turned, he was looking at the wall with the attention it deserved. He did not immediately look at her. Then he walked forward and stood beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her at the wall in the position of someone who is not there to offer comfort or wisdom, but to share the weight of a moment too large for one person to carry alone without diminishing it. He placed his right hand on the wall, not on any specific plaque, on the wall itself in the space between two names, the way a hand rests on something heavy when what it is offering is acknowledgement rather than solution. He left it there for 30 seconds. Then he removed it and looked at her shoulder in its sling and said nothing about it and looked at her face and nodded once. The same nod she had seen in the doorway of the medical clinic on day 108, the same fractional precise acknowledgement that contained more than most conversations managed to carry. He turned and walked back across the courtyard without looking back. She watched him go and said nothing, because Owen Dale was not a man who needed things added to what he had already said. In Whitaker's office at 800, she sat across from him and Merritt, who carried a new folder and the forward momentum of someone fully inside the next chapter. Whitaker told her that Dragonseal's successor program designating Tower 4 had been formally authorized. Counterintelligence and accountability operating within the special operations community, identifying and building cases against personnel, compromising operations through betrayal, institutional manipulation, and abuse of authority. NATO and Joint Command had reviewed the Fort Bragg case and designated it proof of concept. He said they wanted her to command it. She said she was aware the offer was coming. He looked at her with the fractional expression she had come to read as his version of amusement. He confirmed the rehabilitation timeline. 8 weeks partial release, 16 full-duty certification. Merritt opened her folder and placed 3 dossiers on the table. 3 photographs, 3 names, 3 duty stations. Fort Carson, Colorado. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington State. Riley looked at the photographs in order. The first 2 were faces she did not recognize, people she would need to study, patterns she would need to map. From the beginning, the patient work of becoming invisible in someone else's professional space. She had done it before. She knew how long it took and what it required and what it cost. The third photograph stopped her. The man was in his late 50s in dress uniform at a formal function. His posture carrying the comfortable authority of someone who had inhabited senior rank long enough to stop performing it. She had seen the face before once, 5 years ago, in a DIA training file pulled from her access before she could finish reading it. She had noted the interruption at the time and filed it under things to return to when the opportunity arose. The opportunity had not arisen until now. He had been the intelligence coordinator responsible for assembling the mission package for Dragonseal's final operation. He had been the person who provided Thomas Carr the coordinates that became the operational baseline. He had been 2 levels above Brett Caulfield in the chain that ended at 2,247 hours on September 14, 2019. Caulfield had changed the coordinates. Caulfield had executed the transmission. But someone had known the operation architecture well enough to identify exactly which coordinates to alter and what the specific terrain effect of that alteration would be. Someone who had the mission package before it reached Dragonseal. Someone positioned technically and organizationally to instruct Caulfield on precisely what to do and to ensure the investigation afterward would not reach past Caulfield to find the person who had given the instruction. Somalia had not been one man's cowardice. It had been 2 men's calculation. Riley looked at the photograph for a count of 10. She closed the folder. Whitaker asked if she needed time to consider. She said no, sir. She said she would begin preliminary assessment work during the rehabilitation period and be ready for full deployment at 16 weeks. She said she would need one additional resource, a field observer, with demonstrated capability for reading people under operational conditions, someone able to function effectively without requiring extensive situational briefing. Whitaker said he assumed she had someone in mind. She said, yes, sir. Merritt made a note and closed her own folder. Riley stood, picked up the dossiers with her right hand, held them under her right arm. She thanked Whitaker. He said, Captain. She paused at the door. He said your father knew what he was doing when he taught you what he taught you. I hope you know that. The morning light was coming through the office window at the same long amber angle it had maintained for weeks, making the red clay of Fort Bragg's perimeter look fixed and permanent and older than any of the structures built on top of it. She said, yes, sir, I know. She walked the corridor at the stride that had not changed, the stride that did not adjust for what had just happened or adjust in anticipation of what was coming. Left arm in its sling, right arm carrying the folder boots on the polished floor. She passed the entrance to the Memorial Garden courtyard. Through the iron gate, the wall with its 11 new plaques was visible in the morning light, bronze catching the low sun with the brightness of something recently installed, not yet weathered to the darker permanence of things that had been present long enough to belong. She did not stop. She had said what she needed to say. At the base of Thomas Carr's plaque, visible only to someone looking for it, someone had made 4 marks in the lower corner of the bronze. Not with any tool in any issued inventory. With a challenge coin, something hard and personal pressed with slow, deliberate pressure by someone who had taken their time and was determined to get it right. 4 words. Thomas Carr's kid. The morning continued around her aircraft and engines and the organized forward-moving energy of a place built to run without stopping. Running without stopping, as it had always run, as it would keep running, regardless of what any particular day contained. Riley Carr walked through it. Her left shoulder sat 3 degrees lower than her right. Permanent, the surgeon had said, or near enough that the distinction did not affect the management of it. She had compensated twice already in the past week without thinking about it, the body finding its new geometry the way bodies do when given no other option. She had her father's hands. She had a folder with 3 names in it, and one of those names connected to a decision made in 2019 that had never been accounted for. And that absence of accounting was the thing she had been walking towards since a night in a communications room when the frequency went to static and stayed there. She had 16 weeks. She was already working. Behind her at the gate to the Memorial Garden, Owendale stood with his coffee and watched her go. He did not call after her. He did not need to. He had already confirmed what he was going to do, had confirmed it on the wall at 0630 with 30 seconds in one hand and no words at all. He would be at her door at 600 Monday morning. She already knew this. She turned left out of the operations building and walked toward the post-surgeon's office for her scheduled follow-up, and the Fort Bragg morning carried on around her, the aircraft and the engines, and the people moving with purpose between buildings, and the 11 names on the wall behind her caught the light and held it bronze going gold in the October sun. Permanent now, public now, belonging to the record, in the way that true things belong to the record, when someone has been patient enough and careful enough to put them there and strong enough to make sure they stayed. Thomas Carr had taught his daughter one thing above all the others. The work is never finished. That is not a reason to stop. That is the definition of the work. She walked on.